author of Book to Traveler's Guide to Literary Locations Around the World and Break It Up, Secession, Division, and the Secret History of America's Most Imperfect Union. He's a frequent contributor to The Nation, as well as the New York Times and the Washington Post. His most recent book, Fear No Pharaoh, is the subject of tonight's discussion. Please give it up for Mr. Richard Kreitner!
Thank you, thank you. Well, I don't know if you all know, but Richard's book was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal this past week, and a really good review, and I can tell you I've read the book. This is a fantastic book. It's really, really, really beautifully written, narratively written, thought-provoking, and just the kind of depth that you just don't get very often. So we're really lucky to hear him talk about this. So, of course, my first question to you, Richard, has to be, why this book? Why did you write this book? I'm going to give you the big question.
Yeah, it's a good one. First of all, thank you very much, Debra, for coming. Debra's book is also amazing. I reviewed it for Chronogram in the fall, totally unrelated to this
We didn't
event.
realize this.
Yeah, not at all, but it's an excellent book. Thank you to Oblong, and thank you to all of you for coming. Why did I write this book? It actually dates back to when I was an undergraduate at McGill. I've got some fellow McGillians in the back there. And I was taking a year-long course in American Jewish history, and I just kind of immediately glammed onto this question about American Jews and slavery and the Civil War. And what did one people, defined by an ancient experience of slavery, famously in Exodus, Passover, what did they do when they arrived and found refuge in a country defined by an ongoing experience of slavery? Only they were not the people who were enslaved. That just, to my mind, immediately presented a whole range of fascinating ethical options and quandaries all along the way of what would you do. So I took an interest in Jewish abolitionists at first, and those who opposed slavery, and to what extent were they drawing on that tradition?
So you started with the anti-slavery.
The good guys, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
A subtitle of the book could be The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Yeah.
And I started with the good guys, who mostly I took an interest in. And I wrote this paper, and it just kind of stuck with me through the years. Through the 2010s, Black Lives Matter became a movement demanding a kind of national reckoning over slavery and its legacy. I was just sitting through Passover after Passover and Seder after Seder, just kind of not really feeling satisfied, that it felt like there was this big question that we were missing. And I would bring these kind of, I read about this in the book, I'd bring these primary documents of a Confederate soldier describing his holding a Seder while away at war. Like, how do you do that?
That is mind-boggling.
And then other documents, we'd have our Seders, we still do, we will next week, in the Catskills, and showing that the actual land, the kind of village that we were sitting in, also had slavery. We often think about it, you write about this in your book, is a southern phenomenon.
Right.
But it was as much a northern phenomenon, at least until 1827 or so in New York. So by around 2020, my last book came out. I was looking for my next topic. The times were feeling biblical. I was reading the Torah for the first time in my life, and just really felt like I could kind of devote a few years to this topic. And then I realized that I wanted to branch out to the bad and the ugly as well, and try to kind of empathize as much as I could with these people and the choices that they made, and why did they make those choices. How could they kind of live with themselves, having a Seder served by your own enslaved servants?
Right.
So that once I hit on that idea of not just doing the people who I admired, but the whole range of political and religious responses to this dilemma, I basically had the book.
Yeah.
And decided to focus on 6 characters against the background of this larger American Jewish encounter.
Okay, stop.
Yes,
You're getting ahead of yourself, but this is good. For those of you who are not Jewish, the theme of the Seder is we were once slaves. So the irony of having families, Jewish families in the South, having these Seders being served by enslaved people, serving them and having them say, at the Seder, we were once slaves, as they're being served by slaves, was one of the most sort of striking things in the book.
Which strikes us, but what's interesting is that did not strike them.
It did not strike
They weren't
they
uncomfortable.
Did not see the irony. But
No.
The American, the Declaration of Independence talks about slavery. We want to be free from the slavery of the British without talking about the actual slavery that was happening in the country. So it's a similar kind of irony. I'd love to have you talk a little bit about the kind of the conundrum that Jewish immigrants to the United States faced. What was particular about their situation that may have made them maybe more accepting, more complicit, less willing to fight against something that they saw as a fight that they couldn't win?
Yeah, there were a couple of factors. I mean, just to put some numbers on the table, in 1850 there's 50,000 Jews in the United States, and by 1860 there's 150,000.
Okay.
So it's rising sharply. It's still fairly small compared to our own numbers today, but it's the era of the first mass wave of immigration. You know, I think most people think about American Jewish history as beginning in 1880. With, you know, the massive wave of 2 million Eastern European Jews. But before that, in the 1840s, there was a smaller, but still substantial wave of Jewish immigrants, part of a much larger group of German-speaking immigrants coming to the United States in the 1840s and the 1850s. And that's along with Irish people as well. So it's the period in American life, in American history, when the percentage of foreign-born people in this country was the highest that it's ever been. So that's triggering a massive nativist backlash. The Know Nothing Party comes into being in the early 1850s. And Jews are not really part of that. They're not targeted by the Know Nothings immediately.
And generally, where are people settling? Mostly, Jews. In New York, in the north?
Mostly in the north.
Okay.
Not necessarily New York. Philadelphia's big, not so much Boston. Probably about 4/5 in the north, I would say.
Okay.
And that's for a couple of reasons. One, Southern life had slavery, which meant it was difficult to kind of break in if you're arriving with little money.
Okay.
And most immigrants, Jewish or otherwise, are going to the north. So there's this massive nativist backlash, and a lot of Jewish leaders, rabbis, editors, are worried about Jews getting kind of swept up in that antagonism. So they want to kind of keep their heads down and not say too much.
Anti-immigrant.
Yes.
Immigrant.
Yes.
Antagonism.
And anti-immigrant, nativism is linked up with abolitionism to a certain extent in the 1850s. A lot of the abolitionists, Wendell Phillips, not so much William Lloyd Garrison, though he was a little bit of an anti-Semite, were anti-immigrants, or were at least trying to kind of, get the attention of these nativist crowds and try to swing it towards the new Republican Party. So that was another reason. And also the abolitionist movement was super Christian,
Right.
They were all kind of fervent Christians of one kind or another, including Garrison, and didn't have such kind things to say about the Jews who had killed Christ.
Right.
As they said.
Believed. Yeah.
They believed.
Yeah.
So those were a couple of the reasons why Jews would kind of stay out of the way. In the South, they didn't really need any excuse to not speak out against slavery because nobody could really speak out against slavery.
That would have been virtually impossible.
Very dangerous.
Right.
And those few who
Dangerous, yeah.
did really lost their livelihoods, not their lives, but
Right.
were run out of town. There's a little section in the book where I talk about Southern Jews who did criticize slavery. One lost his job, the first Jewish professor at the University of North Carolina. He loses his job. There's a Jewish man in Alabama, a lawyer, who speaks out against slavery, not so much for moral reasons, but for economic reasons. He thought it was kind of keeping people from rising up in society, and nobody cares. He's run out of town. He has to go to California. It was really dangerous to speak out in the South, and it was not so expedient to speak out in the North.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I thought your portrait of, you said you chose 6 different people to focus on, and your portraits were just so vivid and so interesting. Who would you say of the characters that you chose to focus on most surprised you when you did the research? Or did you have a good baseline knowledge of all of these interesting?
I mean, I've been researching this for so long now,
okay,
like
so maybe
15
that's
years.
not
Like, I feel like I've
fair.
kind of always known them.
Right. Then what did something about, say, for example, Judah Benjamin?
Yeah, well, that's who I was thinking
you know,
of. I think he's the person who surprised me the most, because I don't know if everybody knows Judah Benjamin,
Say-
Confederate Secretary of State. Before that, a senator very pro-slavery from Louisiana. I'm going backwards here, but before that, he was a plantation owner in Louisiana. He grew up in Charleston, and he was born in the Caribbean. I don't know why I've told that backwards, but and Judah Benjamin is, he has terrible politics. He's pro-slavery, one of the leading, most eloquent spokespersons for slavery in the Senate in the 1850s. He joins the Confederacy, I think reluctantly. It's hard to say. He burnt his papers twice. So we're reconstructing what we can understand of him from other sources. And he's Jefferson Davis's right-hand man. I didn't know that about him. He wrote almost all of his speeches. They spoke pretty much every day.
Yep.
Jefferson Davis was very sickly during the Civil War, and Judah Benjamin, when Jefferson Davis was too sick, was effectively the acting president of the Confederacy. He's the only Jewish person to ever appear on a piece of American currency.
Wow.
If you count the Confederate $2 bill as currency, as American currency. But what surprised me about him is that personally he seems like a really likable guy.
He seemed like a bit of a character, and so
Yeah.
everybody kind of got a chuckle over this guy. It was short, right? He was small.
Short. He was beefy. I mean, I kind of see myself in him a little bit. Yeah, he had black curls around his head, but he was a great storyteller. He had tons of poetry memorized. He could quote Shakespeare,
Probably
to the
somebody
point.
fun to have over for dinner in a lot of ways.
Absolutely, he loved gambling. He was quite possibly gay, which is something that
Right.
biographers are only beginning to feel comfortable talking about.
Right.
All the past biographers who were mostly kind of pro-Confederate
Right.
chroniclers would hint at this, but they didn't want to talk about it or even know how to talk about
Right.
it, probably.
Right.
So just the roundedness of him as a person
Right.
was really interesting to me. And the other kind of appealing quality about him is that he did not let any setback in his life kind of get in his way. He had this incredible drive and ambition. So when he loses his plantation to a massive flood, he just kind of picks up and keeps going. He has this really weird marriage to this woman who lives in Paris for more than that, 30 years without him. And the Confederacy is the only leading statesman of the Confederacy not to get arrested at the very end of the war. He escapes like 3 shipwrecks and gets himself to London, where he starts a new career as a barrister. So he's just a fascinating person. And
Yeah.
I mean, he's somebody who I think most people know.
Maybe
If you
not.
think Jews in the Civil War, you probably think Judah Benjamin. But I wanted to kind of put him in conversation with all these other people
Right.
who took wildly different paths through the
Right.
same tumultuous period.
Right. Well, how about let's do the other extreme and talk about maybe one of the more sort of fervent abolitionists, possibly.
Yeah, well, I love them all, so I'm going to have a hard
I
time
know.
choosing. Ernestine Rose kind of
I
jumps
was
to
going to
mind.
mention Ernestine Rose because I really enjoyed her. I thought she was fascinating.
Do you guys know Ernestine Rose?
Total
No? Great.
atheist.
Okay, so Ernestine Rose, most of these people who came to America in this period were from Germany or Austria. She was from Poland. She was the daughter of a rabbi. And she, I almost want to say, escaped Poland. I think that's how she saw it. Her father tried to arrange a marriage for her that she did not want. So she fled to Berlin, where she picks up some of the Enlightenment philosophies. Then she finds her way to London. She becomes a socialist under Robert Owen, who's this utopian industrialist trying to really change the economy and the world. She meets a man. They come to America in 1836, and she immediately starts barnstorming the country, giving these incredible speeches. Everybody talks about what an amazing orator she was, against economic inequality, so she's a socialist, against women's subjugation, so she's arguing for married women's property laws, so that women entering marriages get to keep their own property, 12 years before Seneca falls. Just this incredible pioneer. She's a really hardcore atheist in the kind of new atheist vein. She proudly identifies herself as an infidel and hosts conventions every year with her husband. So she goes around denouncing organized religion. She really tries to separate herself from her Jewish origins. Her enemies within and without the movement don't really let her do that. So she's kind of always forced to stay in this box, which is actually quite similar to Judah Benjamin, who also wanted nothing to do with his Judaism, but was really never allowed to escape it. Then finally, she's a really serious abolitionist, probably the only Jew who William Lloyd Garrison ever knew. And she denounces slavery roundly. She even travels through the South with Susan B. Anthony in 1854, where Rose is the star speaker and Anthony is just her assistant.
Wouldn't you love to be a
denouncing
fly on the
slavery.
wall and just hear some of those speeches?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just incredible to hear.
So she's interesting because she's Benjamin's political opposite, but she has pretty much the same kind of religious philosophy as him.
Right. What about, there was a rabbi in New York who was very brave. The rabbi in New York
Coward.
was the
Rabbi in Baltimore.
coward. He was making pro-slavery speeches, from the synagogue in New York.
Yeah, really just one. During the secession crisis in
Okay.
1861, after South Carolina has seceded, President Buchanan, who is against secession but does not want to do anything about it, calls for a national day of prayer and fasting.
Oh, right.
For everybody to go to church or synagogue or wherever and just pray to God to deliver us from, what's happening. And a lot of people were like, you should just fix it. You should just, why God? In any case, this rabbi, Morris Jacob Raphall at B'nai Jeshurun in New York, which is ironically now one of the more progressive synagogues in the city, delivers a sermon called The Bible View of Slavery, in which he's intervening in this debate that's raging. Slavery's tearing the country apart. It's a very religious country. Is the Bible for or against slavery? And at the time, a lot of people looked to Jews to kind of explicate the Old Testament. They were the authorities on at least the first part of it.
Right.
And Raphall kind of intervenes in this debate to say the Bible is for slavery. And it's blasphemy that the abolitionists say that it's not. And this...
Yeah, he went so far as to say it was actually blasphemy
Yeah,
against slavery.
to be against
Yeah.
slavery. He said that the South was not practicing it in accordance with the Torah's laws,
Because
that it was
they
too
were-
harsh.
Yeah.
And so he wanted the South to kind of ameliorate the condition of slaves, and the North to stop being so aggressively anti-slavery.
Did
so that
he
was,
feel that the Torah said that eventually slaves could become free? They could work for a period of time that wasn't a lifetime of slavery, but it was...
Yeah, well,
Okay.
the Torah has all these stipulations. You know, I kind of start the book with this, is that, well, first of all, it's just strange for people to base its story in one of subjugation. Like, that's not the typical national narrative
No.
in ancient history. You would want to tell a story about heroism
Right.
and power
Right.
and glory.
Right.
And instead, they do something quite different,
Right.
which is interesting. And then in the Torah, the first thing that they do when they leave slavery in Egypt, the first laws they draw up is laws about slavery. So they're going to keep having it, but they're going to introduce laws limiting it. But they don't abolish it, so that creates this debate that I'm
This
tracking.
muddy area, yeah.
So he's citing all those restrictions on slavery to say that slavery is allowed, but it should be more humane than it's practiced in the South. And he kind of presents this as a peace proposal. So if the North gives up something and the South gives up something, we can get together and avoid the Civil War. But obviously that doesn't happen, and instead it creates this massive debate that spirals well outside his synagogue and indeed outside Jewish circles into mainstream newspapers, the New York Herald Tribune, and all other ones, the New York Post, about this crazy debate that these Jews are having about slavery. And at that moment is when the heroic rabbi, David Einhorn, another of my
Einhorn,
characters,
that's right, yeah.
who is in Baltimore, speaks out and denounces Raphall's
In
pro-slavery
Baltimore, which
sermon.
was a kind of a dangerous place for him to speak out against slavery.
Absolutely. So he arrives in Baltimore in 1855 and immediately starts denouncing slavery. And his you can in reading the accounts of it, you can hear his parishioners or his congregants kind of squirming in their seats, getting pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then 1861, when he denounces Raphall and he denounces slavery, he's actually run out of town by a pro-slavery mob that's running rampage through Baltimore, not just to target him, but they were coming for him. And he leaves the city. He goes to Philadelphia, and his congregation writes to him and says, "Hey, you want to come back? But you have to be quiet about slavery. You can't say anything about slavery." He says, "No, I'm not going to do that."
Yeah.
So he's a really interesting, heroic figure who's known. He's known in big American Jewish surveys. You'll read about this episode,
Right.
but there's very little. He exclusively wrote in German. There's very little kind of rounding him out as a person. I don't read German myself. I hope somebody writes a biography of him someday. But I went through all the sources that I could
Right.
read to kind of build out his story of who he
Right.
was.
One of the interesting things I think about your book is the fact that there was no you couldn't say one big sweeping statement because there was such a variety of responses by Jews to slavery. and Civil
One sweeping
War.
statement of what the Jewish position.
There was no official Jewish position, but also you capture this sense of vulnerability, this sense that you if you stick your neck out, you are making a very deliberate choice and you are endangering yourself. So there were a lot of people who just felt, no, I will do the expedient thing and I will kind of go along in some way or another.
Right. Well, that's introducing my other character, Isaac Mayer Wise.
Right.
Who's so of the rabbis, there's Raphall, who's the pro-slavery New Yorker. There's Einhorn, the anti-slavery Baltimore guy, and then the third one is Isaac Mayer Wise, who's more famous than any of them. He founded some of the major institutions of Reform Judaism, Hebrew Union College, some other ones. He had a very widely read newspaper called The Israelite, in which, in the wake of this whole debate between Raphall and Einhorn and a lot of other people about Jews and slavery and the secession crisis, and then after Fort Sumter, he publishes an editorial in his newspaper that says, "Silence our policy." So our policy on this, our policy as Jews should be silence. Let's just not get involved here. Let's not draw any attention to ourselves. We don't need it. This is a pretty good place for us. We're accepted as white, which is a very important piece of it. And we don't need to be rocking the boat here. He was personally anti-slavery, but even more so, he was anti-abolitionist because he thought that their religious fervor, their political fervor would do no favors for Jews.
It was too radical. It was too extreme.
Yes,
Yeah.
and he is really a stand-in for a whole tendency, I think, of doing Jewish politics in this country.
Okay, that's an interesting
That's
thing.
off on another tangent.
Well, I want to talk also because you have some interesting things about how after the Civil War, things got more complicated. There was more of a sense of anti-Semitism that came in, even, isn't that true? Just sort of during the post-Civil War period?
Yeah, well, it begins with the war. The war
Yeah,
itself,
right.
like a lot of periods of civic disorder
Yeah.
in this country and elsewhere,
Yeah.
is accompanied by a massive, really an explosion of anti-Semitism
Right.
in the North and in the South.
When things go bad, blame the Jews.
Yeah, I mean, that had not really been a feature of
Right.
American life to that point.
Right.
It's not like the Panic of 1837 saw,
Right.
but now there's a fairly large and increasingly visible Jewish presence in the country, and they're a pretty handy scapegoat.
Right.
So in the South, Judah Benjamin gets a lot of this criticism. Jefferson Davis was not universally popular among Southerners. There's a whole faction that were against him, and they took aim at the power behind the throne,
Oh,
Judah Benjamin, who was kind of the scapegoat for all of the Confederacy's diplomatic setbacks, economic troubles, military struggles. And then in the North, Jews got the blame for, what's become a common anti-Semitic trope of, profiteering off the war rather than fighting in it.
Right.
And the most famous, or the most notorious anti-Semitic policy that's ever been adopted by the U.S. government was Ulysses S. Grant's Order Number 11, issued during the Civil War, which is when Grant was not yet the commander-in-chief of the Army, or the general-in-chief, but had his own little military district in Mississippi and Kentucky. And he issued an order banning all Jews from his district, just all Jews. That had never been done before. The South didn't try anything like it. And they tried to put it into effect and actually started clearing Jewish families from a town in Paducah, Kentucky, some of whom made their way all the way to Washington, D.C. to meet with Lincoln to ask that he overturn the order, which he did. And that's usually been celebrated in most accounts as a very kind of triumphalist moment in which, the Jews organized, pled for their rights, and were acknowledged, and their wishes were granted. I see it quite differently as a fairly traumatic moment, and that even though Lincoln overturned the order, American Jews at the time, especially leaders, didn't really forget what had happened,
Right.
and they saw the ground kind of falling out beneath them.
Things that they thought were stable were not so stable.
Exactly, and then
Yeah.
after the war, the Gilded Age is another period of really serious anti-Semitism. Here in Saratoga Springs, there's a famous incident where a Jewish businessman named Joseph Seligman, who made his fortune during the war, is denied entry to a major hotel in Saratoga Springs. That's kind of considered the starting gun, to use a Saratoga metaphor, of a new kind of anti-Semitism in American life. Jews are banned from Coney Island. And all this begins, I think, in the Civil War. So though the story of American Jews in the Civil War has often been told as, again, like a triumphalist, kind of feel-good account of Americanization. We fought in the trenches with non-Jews, and it was a way of kind of, the blood that was spilled on the battlefield is what I call a down payment on belonging. I think quite the opposite, actually. It was actually kind of a destabilizing experience. And it led to certain attitudes being adopted before that next big wave of
Wait,
East European.
what was the destabilizing experience? The war
the
itself?
anti-Semitism.
The anti-Semitism
anti-Semitism, yeah.
destabilized.
Destabilized this
Right.
sense of belonging that American Jews before the war, partly because
Okay.
of slavery, because prejudice was directed on a different group.
Right.
Now, after the war, after emancipation, I think they feel significantly less secure.
Okay, I see.
And even in 1869, when Decoration Day, then Memorial Day, is starting to be celebrated, there's a Jewish newspaper that says this is a bad idea. We should leave that war in the past and not remember it.
Wow,
Because it was a
yeah.
difficult experience.
Yeah. That's great. Let's see. Well, I think you've captured a lot of the. Did we talk about all six?
I think we missed August Bondi.
Oh, Bondi.
We could talk about?
Bondi was one of my favorites.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
So I start and end the book with this guy, August Bondi, who is born in Vienna, and he fights in the revolution in Vienna in 1848 as a teenager. He's 15 years old. He joins the battalion of the Faculty of Philosophy, which as a philosophy major myself, I just like to imagine us forming some kind of corps.
Philosophers.
And that revolution falters and ultimately fails. His family decides to leave Vienna, along with many other Jews and non-Jews. They're fleeing both the economic turmoil that had precipitated the revolution in the first place, and then also the return of reaction in Vienna and throughout Europe.
What year was this?
1848.
Okay.
Yeah. And they sail to America, and they first go to St. Louis, and he eventually finds his way to Kansas. He's just looking for something to do, and he finds his way to Kansas, where Bleeding Kansas is in full swing.
Right.
This struggle over whether slavery will expand to the Western
Right.
territories, and he runs into John Brown and his sons.
That's right.
This hardcore abolitionist John Brown, a few years before the attack on Harper's Ferry, is the first, free stater to argue for those who are against slavery expanding to the territories, taking up arms and fighting the pro-slavery invasion of border ruffians, Missourians, who are
Another
coming
conversation I would have loved to be a fly on the wall.
Bondi and Brown?
Yeah, Bondi and Brown.
Excuse me, but you kind of can be. In my book that's available at Oblong Books. But his memoir, which I read many years ago, 10 years ago or something, in the Center for Jewish History in Manhattan. There's a typescript of it, and I think the original manuscript is in Kansas. He left, later in life, he started leaving these memoirs, which are not like beautifully written, they can't just be published as is, which is why I always kind of pictured it as like a film or something.
Oh, okay.
But then found its way into here. But he just left this incredibly detailed memories of what it was like to camp out with John Brown in Kansas
Yeah.
and fight what were effectively the first battles of the Civil War.
Yeah.
And it was it was small scale, but they had cannons, and they were,
Right.
the Americans were fighting Americans for the first time.
Right.
And then eventually joins the Union Army. He's wounded. He goes home. But he's just.
So remind me, did Bondi decide that he wouldn't go on to the raid at Harper's Ferry with Brown?
I'm not sure that he decided. He just wasn't with Brown.
It didn't happen.
He did split with Brown in Kansas because he was against Brown's first plan for starting a slave insurrection, which was going to be in Louisiana.
Oh, yeah.
And Bondi's a complicated guy. You'll find articles about him online. The Jewish conductor on the Underground Railroad, that kind of overstate things. He did help out with escaped slaves at some point for a few months, but he really got into the whole thing, went to Kansas in the first place, not because he was this incredibly noble universalist, abolitionist or something. He was part of the more kind of racist side of anti-slavery fighting in America, which was that slavery was, bad for white people, bad for white laborers because it kept wages down, bad for white farmers because they could not move west to new slave territories and have an equal go of it. So there was a whole political tendency in American life, which actually powered the rise of Lincoln and stuff,
Right.
which was not abolitionist, but it was anti-slavery, but
Right.
not for the most noble reasons.
Right.
And Bondi's such an interesting mixture of noble reasons that, like a lot of 1848ers, people who, Jewish and non-Jewish, who fled Europe after the revolutions and still were looking for some kind of idealistic enterprise to throw their energies into, and found it in the anti-slavery struggle. And so he does say that I joined the Union Army because as a Jew I felt like I had an obligation to fight for all people and all beliefs. So there's that part of it, but the other part of it is he says explicitly, I did not fight for the black people, I fighted for the white people,
That is so
which he
interesting.
wanted to be a part of.
Was Bondi the one whose wife was pro-slavery? Wasn't there one abolitionist who's...
I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, I missed
There's a whole section in the book of like divided families.
Oh, yeah.
So there is a congressman named Philip Phillips. That's how people named each other back then. Who was from Alabama, and he was pro-slavery initially. He actually wrote the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which began the whole fight over Kansas. But then, as Southerners get increasingly radical, he started to retract a little bit, and he was against secession. While his wife Eugenia was for secession and pro-Confederate, and she was arrested twice during the war, once in D.C. and once in New Orleans for being a Confederate spy.
Wow.
And they both left incredible memoirs that I draw on that are really colorful. When she's arrested in New Orleans, she's sent to this prison island in the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, excuse me. And just it's funny, it's dark. But that was a divided family, and there were many others. I'd say at the beginning, Jews were just like everyone else, only more so. And their experience of the Civil War was shaded for some of them. I think for most of them, one way or another, by their Jewishness.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, how many years would you say it took you to? How many years have you been working on this book?
That's a tough question because there's
You started doing undergraduate work in the...
Yeah, and then I dropped it and I picked it up.
Okay.
The writing itself is maybe a year and a half or 2 years.
But you must have had a lot of, was the research ongoing as you were writing, or did you feel you had as much research as you could possibly get?
Before I started writing, I usually do a little bit of both. Definitely more research as I'm writing. But yeah, I think I turned my full attention to this book right around COVID, so
Okay.
winter of 2020.
Okay.
Yep. Named my son, who was born in March, Jeremiah, because I was so steeped in,
Oh,
you know,
that's great.
the Torah. But yeah, but I'm always, you know, I've got documents open on my computer for the next 5 books, so it'd be hard to say how long I've been working on it.
Did it make you feel differently? You mentioned several times reading the Torah. Did it make you feel differently about Judaism as you were researching it? Did it make you just go back and try to read more and to kind of go deeper into it?
You mean reading the Torah? Or
Reading the
this book?
Torah. In doing this book, you mentioned several times that you were reading things in the Torah.
Yeah, I mean, only really at the beginning, if I'm being honest. I mean, the whole enterprise, I think, has allowed me to kind of see my Jewishness differently. My last book was a history of secession in the United States, which was, you know, not to overstate it, but each one's kind of autobiographical in a way.
Right.
Where the first, you know, that allows me to kind of explore my very ambivalent, ambiguous feelings about being an American, and this one allowed me to explore my very ambiguous, ambivalent feelings about being Jewish.
Jewish American.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I've arrived at any kind of radically different place that I
Right.
started at, but, you know, deeper and, you know, more complex.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I think most authors do have to, if you're going to devote that many years of your life to a book, it has to be deeply personal in some
Right.
way. You know,
Right.
otherwise it's just not going to be that good a book, I think.
Right.
That's my feeling about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think academics have their own kind of incentive
Yeah, that's
structures,
true.
which is why it's so great that we're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry if there's any
Yeah.
academics there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I would love to see if we have any questions for Richard. We've covered a lot of the waterfront. I think a lot of it is just, you have to read it, and it's a fast read, it's a good read, it's a kind of a well-paced story, so you never feel as if, oh God, I have to read another chapter, because you want to know what's going to happen next, even though you know the larger story, but you don't know as well the deep dive into these individual stories, which
Yeah.
I found
Thank
utterly
you.
fascinating.
I mean, in lieu of any immediate questions, I could read a passage. Should I do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, is that all right?
That'd be a great idea.
Okay. Should I read the beginning? Do you want something from the beginning or from the meat of the book?
Me.
Meat. Okay. Good guys or bad guys?
Bad.
Bad? Oh, okay. All right, I will.
It's like a whole party game you could do.
What'd you say?
It's like a whole party game.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so this is chapter 9. It's called A Storm Vast and Terrible. In June 1862, as the Union Army crept up the Virginia Peninsula towards Richmond, a rabbi in Chicago mulled a difficult question. A few years earlier, Bernhard Felsenthal had gotten in trouble with the board of his synagogue in southern Indiana for endorsing John C. Fremont's anti-slavery campaign for the presidency. He then declined to apply for a rabbinical post in Mobile because accepting it would have required staying silent about human bondage. Now at the helm of a Reform congregation in Chicago, Felsenthal felt free to speak his mind on the issue tearing the country apart and the American Jewish community along with it. Felsenthal's article, Die Juden und die Sklaverei, that's my best, The Jews and Slavery, ran in the Illinois Staatszeitung, a popular journal among German-speaking Republicans, both Jews and Gentiles, who still fired up with the fervor of revolutionary ideals from 1848, tended to be pro-union and anti-slavery. Yet, as Felsenthal observed with chagrin and bafflement, Southern Jews were overwhelmingly supportive of both slavery and the Confederacy. How is it possible, the rabbi mused, quote, that members of a tribe which for millennia has been oppressed, persecuted, and enslaved are defenders of the most shameful institution on earth, slavery, and enemies of the struggle for freedom? Felsenthal was mystified, as generations of American Jews have been ever since, that a community haunted by its own history and still oppressed in Europe would support the perpetuation and extension of bondage in a land supposedly devoted to liberty and equality. It was astonishing, he wrote, that, quote, people who each morning and each night thank God for freeing their fathers from Egypt's enslavement, whose brothers and relatives in the old world today still have to petition and agitate for their own emancipation, here reveal themselves as fanatic apologists for Negro slavery. It still surprises many to learn that Jews living in the Confederacy embraced breaking up the Union at least as fervently as their brethren in the North supported its preservation. By 1861, Jews could be found in every prominent southern city and most of the larger towns, even in remote backwoods outposts. Many were shiftless salesmen wandering from farm to farm, town to town, peddling their wares. Others had graduated to shopkeeping. A rare few were teachers, lawyers, and doctors. Some were planters. Native-born Jews and new arrivals alike felt grateful to the states and the section that had accepted them, even more than in the North, as fully credentialed members of society. That is, as white. Southern Jews did not support the Confederacy or join its armies solely because they wished to curry favor with their neighbors. They were part of the South. They shared the principles, practices, and prejudices of other whites. Right up to 1865, Southern Jews used their claimed property as cooks and maids, as assistants in their businesses, and as field hands. Some even hauled their slaves with them to the front lines. The rate of slave ownership among Jews in the South had dropped by more than half between 1850 and 1860, from 38% of Jewish adults owning slaves to 17%, partly because less wealthy immigrants who had a harder time raising the capital to purchase human beings came to make up a larger percentage of the region's Jewish population. But whether they owned slaves or not, most Southern Jews, like other whites, felt invested in the slave system and terrified of the consequences of abolition. The vast majority of Jews in the South supported the Confederacy, sincerely and wholeheartedly. There's little evidence to suggest they were engaged in an elaborate performance intended to convince others of a commitment to slavery that they did not in fact possess. There's instead plenty of evidence showing Jews, even in private, embracing the Confederate cause, both the perpetuation of slavery and the secession seen as necessary to secure it. The alliteration that I love to put is much more difficult when you read it out loud. Embracing the Confederate cause with as much passion and pride as other Southerners. Some even felt that as historically marginalized immigrants in the Old World, they had more at stake than most in ensuring that another class of people filled that role instead of them in the New. In a letter to his family, one Jewish soldier from Mississippi said he sympathized not with the enslaved, but with the poor victims of abolition despotism. While some Jews in the North saw the struggle against slavery as an outgrowth of their attempts to overthrow European absolutism in the 1848 revolutions, like August Bondi, immigrants who had settled in the South compared the Lincoln administration to the tyrannical regimes they had escaped. What was Lincoln's attempt to beat the slave states into submission, but an American version of Emperor Franz Josef's vicious suppression of the campaign for Hungarian independence? In Savannah, Jewish immigrants joined with other German speakers at a meeting in May 1861 to proclaim their allegiance to the Confederacy. Just as Jews and Christians together had manned the barricades in Europe to beat back the hired soldiers of despotic governments, the immigrants vowed they were again, quote, ready with heart in hand to defend the home of their choice, the Confederacy. If some Southern Jews may have had qualms about the peculiar institution or doubted the prudence of secession, most saw their aspirations as linked with the war for Southern independence and the establishment of a new nation dedicated to preserving the rights and privileges of whites, a favored class among which they were pleased to find themselves for once included. Jacob Wheel, Jacob Wheel, a cotton merchant in Montgomery, Alabama, had bought slaves to help establish his cotton dealing business in his new hometown, then freed them as soon as he could, believing, as he wrote his brother in Germany, that, quote, one man never has the right to own another man. But he also did not think the North had the right to take away property that had been legally purchased. Writing in the war-mad weeks after Fort Sumter, Wheel rejected both extremes, the fire-eating Southern secessionists and the anti-slavery Yankee meddlers. Quote, in this dispute for a man of reason is no place left, Wheel sighed. Of two evils, I choose the one more familiar. Victory for the South might usher good things for the Jews, even perhaps a new golden age. Defeat promised only more of what a long-suffering people needed least, immiseration and subjugation. Like many Jews in the slave states, Jacob Wheel felt grateful to the South and figured he owed something to it in return, maybe even his life. That was why he enlisted in the Confederate Army, he told his brother. Quote, this land has been good to all of us.
That's
I'll leave it there.
It was very interesting because you mentioned there was a group of recruits in Macon, Georgia, of Jewish recruits, of Jewish.
Yeah, I think that's often been presented as an all-Jewish battalion.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of myths told about Jews in the Civil War, which I tried to overthrow.
Yeah.
There were a lot of Jews in that regiment, but it wasn't like an
It wasn't
all-Jewish
all
or even majority Jewish regiment. Any
Does
questions?
anyone have any questions?
I have a question. How was Judah Benjamin able to rise to such a position in the Confederacy? I mean, was he a recent immigrant? Had he been in the U.S. for a long time?
Yeah, good question. He was born in the Caribbean, so he's a British subject from birth, which ends up being important when he goes to London after the war. His family moves to Charleston when he's 10 years old, right after the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion, and the bodies, of the accused are probably visible from the top floor of his house. So he grows up in Charleston, in a slave city. He goes to Yale. He's only the second Jewish student ever at Yale. He leaves under really mysterious circumstances. He, breaks his relationship off with his father, who's an interesting figure. He moves to New Orleans, very importantly, because in New Orleans, there's a lot more mixture going on. There's Jews, there's Creoles, there's French people, and he picks up French. So he's able to rise in New Orleans. He probably would not have been able to rise as far in Virginia or in Charleston, South Carolina. He buys a plantation in 1842, I think, to kind of further ingratiate himself with the planter class that's going to determine his political future and fate. And his side gig as a planter is cited when he's nominated for the Senate in 1852 as a reason why he should be nominated. He probably understands the needs of the larger kind of white ruler class in Louisiana. So yeah, that's pretty much it. He's able to rise in Louisiana and in New Orleans specifically. And then by the time the Confederacy rolls around, he's a prominent spokesperson. And Jefferson Davis wanted one person in his cabinet from each of the Confederate states. And Benjamin was kind of a natural choice for Louisiana. His first job was not Secretary of State, but Attorney General, because he was in addition to being a U.S. Senator, he was a really prominent lawyer. He argued in front of the Supreme Court. He was a corporate lawyer. His corporate interests sometimes aligned with his political, choices, as has happened and happens now. So he was chosen as Davis's Attorney General, which was immediately a bad fit for various reasons. He was kind of above it. And then he was Secretary of War, which he had even less business being because he'd never been anywhere near a battlefield and was corpulent and could barely ride a horse. And all the Confederate generals were really hostile to him. The fat Jew sitting at his desk, they called him. I identified with him. So yeah, he was kind of able to rise. The Confederacy, Jews were I would say, more secure in the South up to the Civil War than in the North. I think that's partly because of slavery.
Yeah, that is fascinating. What's next on your?
Oh God.
I know you're just talking about this book, but I'm sort of curious because you said something about you had a lot of tabs open.
I do. I won't give the details on it.
Okay.
I can't because it's in front of my publisher right now.
Oh, so you actually have a proposal?
Yeah, well, yeah, and
Oh.
is this being live streamed or just taped?
Just tape.
It's taped. It's looking good, so
Oh,
we'll see. But I don't want to jinx it.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'll come back to Oblong when it's
that's
available.
fantastic.
I'll just say it's another sublimated autobiography. Yeah.
This goes afield, but was there much discussion in Europe among Jews about the Civil War?
Such a good question. I wanted to get to that and I did not.
Oh.
I've heard some things. There's a paper written in Hebrew, which I was not able to get translated, that I think may touch on this. I believe that there was some there must have been, it must have gotten back to them. I think there's some stuff in Lincoln studies about this, about, Jews came to America already knowing who the great emancipator was. And that's all I've got.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting question. Yeah,
I
for
haven't
sure.
heard anything or looked into it.
There's little snippets here and
Yeah.
there, but I did not do a deep dive on that question. It's a really good one. I'd like to know more about it.
Okay.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
I did. I have two. I have a really ponderous one, and then I have a follow-up that should be a lot easier to clear the air from the first one. So it feels like kind of the opening assumption is, should people or should a people who have been through incredible injustice bear a memory through the generations that would allow them to sympathize with others in a similar position? Maybe I've got that wrong. I'm thinking about that. I read a piece this weekend that I urge you to read by Taffy
Oh, I read it.
Acker
Fantastic.
about the Holocaust and how
Yeah.
she didn't want to write Holocaust memoirs of a friend's father, and then she came to the decision to do it and to tell his story. And she talks about why she tells the story. It's beautiful, read it. But one of the takeaways is, if you're more than a generation or two from touching the hot stove, you don't know not to touch the hot stove. So my question for you, having done this research, is there anything that you see in the research from people grappling with these issues that allows a memory of pain and injustice to survive for more than a few generations, to be acted on for the sake of justice.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of what I said at the beginning, the kind of wide range of responses, you know. So there's one guy in the book, Aaron Lopez, who's the most prominent, you know, slave trader in America at the time, and the most prominent Jewish slave trader, of course, of the time and of any time, in Rhode Island, in Newport, who was a victim of the Inquisition. You know, he comes to America, his family flees, you know, Iberia at some point. They're in exile for a long time. A lot of the Jews who were involved in the slave trade in the 17th and 18th centuries had been exiled by the Inquisition, so they felt it either in themselves or in their parents. It wasn't very, you know, it wasn't as long ago as Egypt, you know, that they felt themselves persecuted and oppressed. Aaron Lopez comes to America in 1750 at the age of 40 and gets circumcised. Like, he knew the pain. But he turns around and has no problem, you know, enslaving dozens of people and sending ships to Africa. So there's that. And then there's David Einhorn, the anti-slavery Baltimore rabbi, who's appealing to Exodus and subsequent millennia of Jewish trauma to say we do have a special obligation to kind of speak out against it when we see it harming others. And there were others, you know, other Jews at the time who were doing the same thing, invoking, in the excerpt I read, you know, they're talking about 1848, our cousins are still slaves, so to speak, in Europe. So that's more recent. But more ancient ones, you know, they do. They talk about the Inquisition, they talk about Egypt, they talk about the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. So there were a lot of them who were drawing on these, you know, longer ago traumas to argue, you know, never again for anyone. And maybe a kind of implicit question is that fair? Is it fair to adopt that higher standard for ourselves? You know, I think to some extent we would like trauma to be a university from which you graduate with high ideals. That's not mine. That's from somewhere, some podcast or something I heard. But it's often not, you know, often quite the opposite. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about that in his book.
Okay.
And it's not specifically a Jewish story, you know. But there have always been, at least in our tradition, which is the one I've studied, people saying that we should, you know. And that's the Judaism, or maybe more to the point, the Jewishness that appeals to me. What's your easier question?
Easy question. What was the coolest, best, most exciting trove of information that you... I'm curious where you researched this, where you found the information. What was the most unexpected spot?
If we go far enough back, this August Bondi memoir is just incredibly gripping about, you know, it's not written in like a clean style that you could easily print. At one point I was like, oh, New York Review Books needs to like reissue this or something. It's not up to that level of literary merit, but there's a lot of incredible details of blood on the pavements of Vienna. He claims to be the first person to have suggested that they build barricades, you know, out of these old, you know, cement blocks on the
Sounds like
streets.
maybe a fictional treatment would be kind of...
People have done all kinds of things. There was a young adult novel in the 50s, but nobody's ever really dealt with it.
And that was in a museum archive.
Yeah, and the Center for Jewish History. You could go there. Anybody could go there today and read it. And then there's stuff about Kansas and the Union Army, just incredible details of this Jew on the frontier. You know, he ends up being a pig farmer, but he's a very proud Jew. Like, it's just an incredible document. Other stuff, I mean, there's a 3-volume collection of Jewish memoirs from 1776 to 1865 that was put out by Jacob Rader Marcus, who's like the old granddaddy of American Jewish studies in like the 40s, and a lot of them have to do with the Civil War. And they're in these beautiful old volumes, the way they don't make books anymore. And I just, you know, read and harvested those, as I say. But then, you know, far more disturbing kind of archival discovery was this deposition that's in the book in Pennsylvania. In 1780, this guy who lived in Easton and was like a big macher, you know, big guy around town. Not Marx Lazarus, that's a later guy. His name's escaping me at the moment. Michael Hart. And it's basically a deposition from his enslaved servant describing sexual violence in unbelievable detail. It's like I've never seen. My editor, who's read everything in the world, has never seen. And it's not, you know, I struggled with it because it's not about his Jewishness at all. But I still felt like it had to be in there just to, because I found it, you know. And that's like just seeing that actual document, and it's not, she was illiterate, you know, she signs it with an X at the bottom, but it's there, and it's just like, you can just hear the kind of screams in your head. It's really disturbing. It takes up a whole page in the book. So that wasn't like a fun archival discovery. All kinds of other ones. I mean, there's so many details. Like what I love about my own book is like just details, you know, the characters, but also these, like, you know, Bernard Baruch, the Jewish advisor to FDR, he describes in his memoir that his father was in the Klan in the early 1870s. The first Klan was not anti-Semitic. The second Klan, after 1915, after Leo Frank, was. The first Klan had Jewish members riding around, and Bernard Baruch describes finding in a box his father, him and his brother, finding their father's robe. And they were proud because of everything they were hearing at the time. He's from the South, you know, was about how great and noble and heroic the Klan was. I don't want to end on two incredible downers.
That's a really
We have time for
powerful.
one more question.
Okay.
I was just also thinking about what you were saying about not reading German, not reading Hebrew. So did you feel that you had enough in English that you were able to, I mean, to me, it seems like you had an incredible amount of. Do you think there was any kind of Rosetta Stone thing that you missed?
No,
that would
that's
be really-
always the question.
I
for
know,
sure.
isn't it?
I mean, David Einhorn. I wanted to learn German to read David Einhorn's every word.
Yeah.
But there was a memorial volume put out about him in 1911 on his centennial by. I mean, he was really influential in Reform Judaism, not in the institutional way that his rival Isaac Mayer Wise was, but in a philosophical way. He's a fascinating person. That translated a pretty good number of his sermons, certainly the key ones, the Civil War ones. When he escapes Baltimore for Philadelphia at the beginning of the Civil War, in 1863, he gives this incredible, like 2-3 weeks after the Gettysburg Address, he gives us this incredible sermon that ends up getting printed by a non-Jewish, the Union League Club. It's like gentleman's club that recognized both what he had sacrificed and his kind of courage in speaking out against slavery. So some of this stuff has been translated either at the time or a couple decades later. There was a little bit of a biography in there as well. There's one guy who seems to still be alive who has studied him in this like really like theological way. So that gave me some insights into his theology and how that's connected to his
Oh,
politics.
that's interesting. Yeah.
Because Einhorn saw both the Jews and the United States as both having this kind of messianic mission to spread freedom throughout the world. And it's actually a phrase from another rabbi, but Einhorn would have agreed with it. The idea that this other rabbi who may have helped fugitive slaves escape to Canada from Detroit, where he was a rabbi, he described America as this otherwise blessed land, which I use as a chapter title. And that really encapsulates the anti-slavery Jewish view.
Right.
That this is a special place, we're very grateful to be here, but we need to get rid of this one blight on the landscape. And yeah, that's the book, that's the
Yeah.
talk.
I highly recommend.
Thank you so much.